Oh, well, I didn't hit the little thing. Hello, everybody. I won't do my little like whoop. I usually have this animation I run, and uh, you know, I got caught up in chatting here with Martine and totally forgot to hit the little button that runs a little animation. That's cool. You all don't need to see it. Um, my name is Brian Rinaldi. I'm a developer experience engineer at Launch Darkly. I really appreciate all of you for joining us today. Martine's going to teach us about CSS, but before I let her do that, I have to do my little intro. So let me go ahead and do that. First of all, for any of you who are new, I mean, we run a ton of events on cfe.dev every single month. All of them are free, including conferences and everything like that. And the only way I can keep those free is because of sponsors who make it possible for me not to completely blow my life savings on this particular site. So thank you to Netlify. Netlify has been a backer of this site from the beginning. Is one of my favorite platforms for deploying to the web. In fact, CFE.dev is deployed to Netlify. If you are looking for a place to deploy your site, or you're looking for a place to do composable web platform stuff, Netlify has a lot of tools for that. So please check them out. Also, Contentful is, if you're speaking of composable web platform stuff, if you're looking for a headless CMS, Contentful is so easy. I find it really, really intuitive to create your whole content backend and manage that. Whether you're a technical person or a non-technical person, you can easily do that in Contentful. So please check them out as well. So thank you to my sponsors. We've got a bunch of upcoming events that I want to let you know about. We have, first of all, a brand new show. We have Ray Camden, who's been a good friend of mine for going on 20 years. He started a new show we're calling Code Break. It's another live coding show. He's got his next episode coming up next week. So please check out his show. He's going to be live coding a little text game. I don't know if any of you remember back in the day when you used to have these like text-based games, like, they'd be like, oh, you can go right or left and things like that. He's going to build one of those, I think, in JavaScript and Node.js. So that should be fun. You can get details on cfa.dev. Also, we have our interview show all about DevRel called DevRelish. That's myself and Aaron McHale Staples. We're going to be hosting Colin Loretz. This is coming up also, I think, next week. I'm getting my scheduling details confused here, but you can check cfe.dev for all the dates and times and so on, or follow our YouTube channel and get that as well. We're going to be talking about the difference between developer advocacy and developer evangelism. It should be a really interesting discussion. Also, another live coding show. This one from Nick Taylor is called Too Full to Stack. That's coming up on the 29th. So I didn't even realize till he scheduled this. It's leap year, I guess. So yes, it's going to be on the 29th, and he's going to be doing. So the last episode he dug into getting started with Astro. This one he's going to dig even further into Astro. So we're going to spend some more time building an application with Astro. If you're interested in Astro and if you're doing stuff for the web, you really should be. It's really, really great. Check out his episode on the 29th. I've got more shows and other conferences and all kinds of stuff already posted to the site. I won't go through them all, but if you've got feedback, if you're interested in speaking, want to sponsor, or have any other type of reason you want to contact me, you can always reach me at brian@cfe.dev. For those of you who are wondering, yes, this is recorded, whether you're watching on LinkedIn or YouTube or Crowdcast. You can just go back to the URL that you're at right now as soon as this is over and watch the recording. I will also post an edited version down to YouTube, so you don't have to watch me do this whole intro all over again. Speaking of recordings, I think we're at about like 300, maybe more recordings going back 6.5 years on the cfe.dev site. All of them are there for free, available to you. So pick the thing you want to learn and go learn it. It's probably a presentation or two or many there already. I've got lots more to announce coming soon. You can follow on Mastodon, or you join our Discord, or follow on YouTube or LinkedIn. And that is it for my intro. I am going to turn it over. So I'm really interested in this presentation, Martine, because first of all, I've done CSS since like very early days, and somehow I still manage to be terrible at it. So I'm really hoping that you can help teach me some new things. So I'll turn it over to you, Martine, to teach us why CSS is awesome.
Well, hello everyone. We're going to, so CSS is a skill for, but today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the new features that are coming up in CSS. Some of them have been implemented already, some of them have not, or are partially implemented in the browser. So we're also going to talk about what's the current support, right? So I always kind of uh, I'm always a little bit wishy-washy about whether or not I want to present on things that we can't use yet. But I've come to terms with if we don't know it's coming, we can't architect our code to potentially allow for it in the future. If we also, it might, so it definitely can affect our implementation decisions. And also it's cool. It's fun to find out what's coming up. So, why am I not clicking? Oh, there we go. So my name is Martine Dowden. I am a Google GD and Microsoft MVP. I have been coding for a while, and my background is actually in psychology. I started in psych and then got into web as in the UX and UI and got further into the code. And there you go. And here I am today. My passion obviously is in CSS in front end and accessibility. If you want to find more about me, go to martine.dev. It's got all of my publications and all of my information, where I'm going to be speaking at, etc., etc., etc. But back to why you're actually here, CSS. So one of the new things that's come out recently is new pseudo-classes that allow us to select elements. And those new ones is where has in the additions to the nth child syntax allow us to select things in ways that we were not able to do before. So let's look at these a little bit more closely. The first one is and where. I kind of put these together because they're very similar in what they do. And they take a list of arguments. So you can pass in anything. You can pass in classes, you can pass in selector, pass as ID, the same way you would any other selector, essentially. And it's going to apply those styles to anything in that list. The thing is, there's a little bit of a difference in how they work when it comes to specificity. When we calculate specificity, let's put where and is aside for 2 seconds, and let's talk about specificity itself and how we calculate it, because I know that can be a little bit of a difficult topic at times. It's something that is sometimes a little bit difficult to understand, but there's actually math behind it. And so what we do is if we look over here, we have 3 different selectors, right, in our or 3 different pieces in our selector. And we can base on that, there's number values that get attributed to them. So if we take, we have no IDs in here, so 0. Then we look at our classes, pseudo-class attribute, and pseudo-class attributes. So we have 2, right? We have a class, and we have a pseudo-class, we have the dot link. And then we look at our elements, right? We have section in A, so those are our elements. And so based on that, we come up with the number 0, 2, 2. And so what we do is we compare the first number. If the first number is the same, then we compare the second number. If the second number is the same, then we compare the third, right? And so if basically the level of specificity is the same, then it has to do with the order of application in the style sheet, right? The last one wins. And so based on those numbers, we can actually calculate specificity. The cool thing about where is that it doesn't matter what you have in that list, the specificity is always going to be 0. So where is really, really cool for things like when you are wanting to create base styles for certain elements, because it's going to be super easy to override long term because it has a specificity of 0. Anything that gets applied after it is going to override it, no problem. Is a little bit more dangerous to look at because excuse me, is going to have as its specificity anything that's within, if we're going to look at anything that's within those arguments being passed, and it's going to be the most specific one. So in this case, I have an element. So an element in and of itself has a specificity of 0, 0, 1, right? If we look at our trusty little cubes over here. A class, which has 0, 1, 0, and then an ID, which is kind of the most specific thing we can have, right? Which is going to be a 1, 0, 0. So the specificity for this entire piece, or for any of this code would be 100. Much harder to go ahead and override at that point. So it's by default, what I tend to tell people is if you can use where, and then if you need that specificity, then use is. But you got to be very careful about when to use which ones, because you could easily get in a situation where if you do need to override some styles for a specific use case, it's going to become very difficult, because you might, depending on what you have inside of your parameters, that specificity can become quite specific and end up with quite a large number. So let's look at some examples of why we might use where or is. Now these could work for either, right? One of the places I really like to use them in is where we're doing, for example, a link, right? Where we want a link and visited. That often comes into play when we're styling them, because the blue with the default color is probably not what we want. If we have some brand colors we need to follow, we might want to do some fun things with the underline, whatever the case might be. So that's a really good use case. So where and is are really nice because you can put them in the middle of a chain, right, and not have to copy and paste that beginning trunk of that chain like 100 times in order to go ahead and put in your list of elements. Support on it is quite good. So I took these from Can I Use. Most of the screenshots on support that I took are from Can I Use. They still show IE. I'm just going to ignore IE because I don't know about y'all, but I thoroughly celebrated when IE went away, and I don't ever want to look back. But as we can see, our major browsers, Chrome, Edge, Safari, Firefox, and Opera, do have support for both is and where. You're looking at 97% of the population, right, has access to is, and 94 for where. So we're in pretty good shape with that at this point. These are some things we can definitely start using. Obviously, be conscious of your user base and make sure that it's going to work for you. But as a general rule, these are pretty well supported across the board at this time. Another one that we have now is has. So I'm going to pause for a little bit of a story before I go into exactly what has does. But when I first started CSS, I used to say, and I used to tell people, like, you're never going to be able to select based on a child, right? It's never going to happen. We're never going to be able to do that. It's always top down. You're never going to be able to write a selector based on what's going on with the child. Well, that's no longer true. I've had to recant that statement, because we can look at a child element. We can also look at a sibling element, and based on what's happening with the child. So this first one looks at a section that has a child in there somewhere that is a UL, or this one is a section that has a sibling that is a UL, right? We can look at what happens further in or past. So this becomes really, really interesting because now we can conditionally write CSS based on what's going on inside of that element, which we've never been able to do. Not without JavaScript anyway. So one of the places I really like to use it is, for example, in the context of a form. If I have a label and I have my nested input and my label information, right, I can say, hey, anytime something inside of that label has an attribute, so this is an attribute selector, right? So the label has an attribute selector. Before my label, I want to add that little red star, right? So this allows me to programmatically start doing some style things, which historically in this example specifically, we had to add that HTML and remember to add the HTML and remember to add the star every time an input got required. And if it was dynamic, then we had to worry about the star being dynamic and so on. Now we can let the CSS take care of all of that. This is one example of using has, but it's one that I tend to use a lot, which is why I chose it. Here you have the example if we don't nest our labels, which I know we can't always nest the inputs inside of our labels. We can actually go and say, and look at that sibling and says, if it has a sibling that has a property of required than before. So I know this looks kind of weird, right? Putting that right there in our has, right, inside of our parentheses, but we can absolutely do that to go ahead and get the sibling and add the star in there. The support on it isn't awesome quite yet. It's at 91%, so we're getting really close. The problem is in some of the more mobile browsers, but when we're talking about standard web, we're getting there, right? We're starting to, if your population is definitely going to be on modern browsers and definitely updating their browsers, you're starting to get into a situation where it's definitely starting to be usable. Firefox had been the holdout for quite some time, and needed flags, but we're finally there. So that's one that we can definitely start using sooner rather than later. But keep in mind, it's still only 91% of the global population. So you'll definitely want to check what's the dominant browsers your users are using. The last one in our selectors that we're going to talk about is the nth syntax. So nth of child has existed for quite some time, but it was always based on the element, right? So nth child would be what did not allow us to specify anything about the element. Now we can go ahead and say, I want the nth child, but I only want the active element. So I only want something, like I can base it off of the class. So in this case, I could also base this off an attribute, for example, so any kind of selector really. So in this case, I'm looking at, I want the third child, but that is that has a class of active. So I can be even more selective when I'm looking at the children, and looking for a specific, an end of specific child instead of it just being children as a whole. So that's really cool. The support on that is pretty good. Unfortunately, I was not able to find it on CanIUse, so I can't exactly give you the global stats on it, but it is available across all modern browsers, at least the latest versions. So that is super cool. So that's for our selectors. Another way that we have found that we can conditionally apply some CSS is through container queries. Container queries are really awesome for things like when you're trying to create component-based styles, but your component may live anywhere inside of your, could be dropped anywhere. The good old concept of a widget, right? You can stick it anywhere in your application. You don't necessarily know what the context is going to be in terms of size. So now we have to account for that. And container queries allow us to write CSS not just based on the view size, but on the container of the element size, which is really nice. So the container is going to have to get defined, right? You have to tell it what the container is. You can optionally give your container a name, which makes it a little bit easier to read the code and or reference it later. But you basically have different types of containers because you're going to have to define that as a container, right? We're going to define the container around our element so we can tell it what is it that we're going to size. And then we have inline size versus size and normal. So inline size versus size has to do with not vertical and horizontal the way we're typically used to thinking in terms of some of the CSS aspects, but in terms of, if you look at the direction of writing, inline is going to be the direction of writing, and the size is going to be both directions, but more, and handle your other directions. So if you're looking at some languages that may write top to bottom, right? Like some of the some Asian languages, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but some languages are written top to bottom instead of left to right or right to left. Then in that case, your inline size would be your vertical if the language is written from top to bottom. So it has to do with the direction of your language. Once you've established what your container is, so in this case, if we look at these tags, right, if I have an element that is an element for tags, and I want it to be able to be anywhere, but if it's in a small area, if the area is narrow, I want it to stack them. If the area is wide enough, I want them inline, right? I can go ahead and set that my container, I go ahead and give it a type, right? Because I have to define how it's going to resize. And then I can say at container mid-width, yada, yada, yada. And that goes ahead and allows me to conditionally write my normal tag code versus my, hey, if my container is smaller than is smaller than 350 pixels, go ahead and apply these styles instead. So the container query aspect of it is very similar to a media query. You're going to do your min width, you're going to do your max width. All of those are very much available the same way as for a media query. The support on it is across the board. It even got a little badge on Can I Use, which was super cool. That says baseline 2023 newly available across major browsers. So it is definitely there. We're looking at 91% of the population with it. So that's something that, because you still have about 10% of your population, if I'm rounding, that do not have access to it quite yet, it's probably something you're going to want to fall back for. But other than that, it works. As long as people have the latest and greatest, you're looking at the major browsers have it, which is super cool. Container styles are similar to container queries. The container query that we just talked about was related to size. This one is related to adding a custom property. So the use case for that, I haven't exactly found a really good one personally. I end up reverting to just give the thing a different class based on your type. But I would suppose, like, I can see how in maybe a CMS system, for example, you might not be able to do that quite as easily depending on the output. However, basically what this does is allows us to look for, do you have a particular custom property or CSS variable, right? And if the custom property is equal to whatever, then go ahead and apply these styles. So it allows us to set a custom property one place and then basically have it trickle down the application and conditionally style things based on that. So in this use case, I have a bunch of little different tiles which are given a style with a custom property depending on what it is, and then you can style accordingly, right? So that's a way to either style an element or style, change your application. Maybe that could be one way to theme things, for example, based on a theme custom property getting set somewhere. But that one does not have near as good support. So Safari and Firefox are still out. So that kind of cramps our style, right? Because if you don't have Safari and Firefox, if you're just Chrome and Edge, you're only, in this case, you're only looking at about 69% of the population. So that one is definitely still experimental and something that you might want to play around with, but probably not quite ready for prime time. Unless you know for a fact that 100% of your users are on either Chrome and Edge, which is outside of maybe an internal tool or something, is probably unlikely. Nesting. So away from selectors and selecting things, let's look at nesting. So I don't know about y'all, but it's actually very rare for me to write pure CSS anymore. Generally speaking, I'm using some kind of precompiler or transpiler, or we can have wars about what it's called all day long, but essentially I'm using, most of the time I'm using Sass, although you have stylus or less as well that work quite well. But what those allow us to do is nest our CSS, right? We can go ahead and, in order to group things, we can go ahead and nest things inside instead of having to repeat, right? Instead of having to card and card header and so on as we go down the line, I can go ahead and nest them this way. Well, that is actually coming to CSS here very soon. So that we will be able to do that without having to use a some kind of precompiler, which will be super cool. So this is an example of if for a CSS, it works perfectly fine. I can go ahead and have my container and then go ahead and nest all of it, and it's all like everything related to my card, including its container query, and everything can be neatly nested so that I can determine what I'm going to do with my styles. So this, in terms of what I really like it for, is one, it decreases the verbosity a little bit, but it also goes ahead and helps with things like keeping code together. Where the pitfalls happen is if you start nesting and nesting and nesting and nesting and nesting, you get the extra specificity of it, right? So if the code starts looking like an arrow, or as some people may call it, a Christmas tree, you might want to reconsider how deep your nesting is. And that's been true even in SAS and the other compilers that let us nest. That's been true historically and continues to be true with CSS. The support on it is starting to get there. We're looking at 83% of the population. It is across the latest versions of all major browsers. At least on the website, we're still kind of lagging on the web aspect of things. But your main ones like Chrome on Android, Safari on Android, and your webs are there. So we can slowly but surely start using that. The problem with this is there's not really a really good fallback. I haven't found, doesn't mean there isn't one yet, but the last time I looked, I hadn't found a nice way to do a fallback for that. So there you go. But that is definitely coming very, very soon to the broader usage, which will be really, really cool. Typography. Typography is a topic that some of anybody that knows me has probably heard me talk about before, because it's one I'm very, very passionate about. So I'm really, really excited about the new features there. So let's hop right in. Text balance, text balance specifically. I find this one particularly cool because it allows the browser to kind of determine, instead of having the concept of an orphan right here, right? We have this one line, this one word that ends up stuck at the ends, and that's not visually particularly pleasing to have this very long line and then this one word at the bottom. What text wrap balance allows us to do is just tell the browser, hey, if when we get into a situation like this, balance out my text, right? Make it so that my line lengths are going to be roughly equal, and which is going to prevent this kind of having one word dangling at the end. So it's really, really nice for things like titles and headers specifically. Is one of the use cases that I have found. That is really useful, and the big reason why right now it's pretty much going to be for titles and headers and that sort of thing is because it is the number of lines that it will calculate on is a maximum of, at least in Chromium 4, the maximum is going to be browser specific. So if let's say you have a long paragraph, right, that is, dozens of lines, text wrap balance won't do anything for you. It's specifically for short bits of text. So the real use case is things like titles and headers. The support on it isn't great. It's coming. Seems like Safari will get it to us at some point soonish. I mean, it's definitely there in the. They're talking about it, right? It's there, but it's still kind of sketch. The good news though is it's one of those things that if a browser doesn't have it, you can put a text wrap balance, and eventually, when the browser receives it or the user uses that adds that functionality, then it goes ahead and applies itself. So it's one of those things that, although not exactly across the board, isn't going to, unlike not having container queries or nesting not being applied, this one is, well, you'll get it when you get it type of situation. It won't look as good for you, but it'll get there. Initial letter is really cool. That one allows us, it's more related to be able to manipulate how the first letter of something happens. So we've had first letter for a long time, and we've been able to add style specifically to the first letter of a paragraph, a div, or whatever, for quite some time. However, for things like drop caps. So if you think a drop cap is, if you're looking at, think of the old illuminations, right? The old manuscripts from the Middle Ages and so on. That first letter on those manuscripts was gorgeously ornate, right? Obviously, that would have to be done with an image in CSS, but we can actually style that first letter in ways to kind of bring back that concept of the drop cap. So what initial letter, which would be used, in conjunction with first letter, allows us to do is it looks at how many lines do we want that first letter to span, and if we want to sync. So if I have a letter that is 3 lines tall, do I want it to go ahead and sync down 3 lines, or do I only want it to sync down 2 lines and kind of stick up the top? So let's kind of look at what that's going to look like. Oops, there we go. So we have 2 examples here. So this is what I was talking about with the sync, right? The first example, I have my initial letter, I simply gave it a number 3. So I can shorthand that and say, if you only give it one number, it's going to apply an equal amount of lines and an equal amount of sync. So my letter here for my, so it's the paragraph first of type, so my first paragraph, first letter, right? So it's this L. And it's going to be, it's 3 lines tall and it's sunk 3 lines. So it's all the way down. So it's flush, right, with my text. In this case, I've given it 2 properties. I've told it I want it to be 3 lines tall, but I only want you to sync 2 lines, which means that I have 1 line's worth of white space on top, right? So that allows us to play with how far down we want it to go. We could actually sync it more, right, if we wanted to. If I'd given it like a property of 4 here, it would have an extra bit of white space on top. But this allows us to do what previously we were having to use float and a bunch of other various techniques to go ahead and style. Now it comes baked in, which is really super cool. The support on that is, not ready for prime time, let's just say. It's very much still experimental. We're looking at only, and this is the important here, the unprefixed is complete garbage, right? You're looking at 2.28% on the non-prefixed. That's really not good. So yeah, we're not quite there yet. So if you do want to play with that, look up what the support is for the browser that you're using, and you may or may not have to set some flags in order for, and allow some flags on your browser settings to do that. If you are a web developer and you start playing with flags, I made this mistake, so I will let you, early on in my career, so I will share the love and prevent you from making the same. Give yourself 2 different browsers that you play in. So let's say I have Chrome and Chromium on my computer, or you can have, because I'm on Linux, but you could have Chrome versus Canary, for example. Keep one of them standard base every day, because when you're doing your testing for your actual like stuff that you're pushing out, you want the same kind of environment your users are going to have, and then have that browser that you muck with. For Firefox, I have the regular Firefox, which I can keep clean, and the developer Firefox, which I go ahead and play with all the flags, right? But make sure you're either resetting your flags when you're done, or go ahead and have 2 different browsers. That way, you know, you have your playground and you have your one to do legitimate user testing in. Because otherwise, you're going to be like, well, it works on my machine, and all of your users are going to be like, it doesn't work for us. And it took me a while to figure out that's what had happened in that use case. So be aware of that. Once you start playing with flags, you will no longer have the same behavior as the average user, right? Because most people don't go around playing with the new feature flags in their browsers. The transform property. So we've had transform for quite some time in terms of a value and a function that we could pass in CSS. Now we have it as a property, so that allows us to shorthand what we used to do. So basically, this is what we've been able to do for quite some time, where you said transform, rotate, transform, whatever, translate, scale. Now we can just pass it as a single property. So if we're not trying to even if we were to change like a translate and or a scale or whatever, we no longer have to have this. It's just a shorthand. It's stylistic. The actual behavior stays the same. It's just a little bit less verbose to type. So that's pretty cool. And the support on it is quite good at this point. I mean, we're looking at across all major browsers being able to use those properties, at least on the newer versions. So that one's pretty much there. But I do find that there's benefits. I'm going to go back here. There's benefits, pros and cons to having it both ways. Having all of your transforms in one place can be pretty nice. It also allows for, if you're doing any kind of animations, you can animate on transform, which allows you to animate on everything in that transform chain. Excuse me. However, if you individualize them, it means that now you can animate just the rotate, for example. So it really just depends on what your preference in terms of reading it and or what you're trying to do with it, right? So talking about animation, let's talk about scroll-driven animations, which are brand new and really, really cool. I should start counting how many times I say things are really, really cool in this presentation, because I mean, to me, it's all really, really cool. So scroll timeline and animation timeline, the combination of the two basically allow us to create an animation which the timeline of which is tied to your scroll. So let's say you're scrolling. So generally when you create an animation, you're going to give it a time, right? I want it to execute in X amount of time. In this case, what it's going to do is your percent on that animation, so how far into the animation you go, is going to be tied to your scroll. So how far down you scroll. So if you scroll 50% down the page, you'd be 50% through your animation, which is super cool. The thing is, you're going to give it an axis on which direction you're going to scroll, because you can give it, you're going to want to know like when it's going to trigger, right? And you're going to also, you can do an inset, which is how far into the progress you're going to go. So let's take a look at all of this in terms of code. What we have here is I have a progress time bar, and I'm going to increase the width of that progress timeline based on how far down my page I scroll. So for the concept of maybe, let's say it's an article and I want to know how far down the article I am, or maybe I'm filling out a really long form and I want to know how much progress I've made down this form, I can go ahead and create that progress. So in this case, you'll see that I'm also changing colors as I scroll just because, but in this case, here is that grow progress for that increases and decreases, right? I'm simply doing a scale. When I'm at 0, I'm going to scale to 0, and when I'm at 1, I'm going to scale to 1, right? I'm simply scaling the width of this bar. Where this gets interesting is here, right? I'm going to say that the animation is called grow progress. That's the name of my animation. I'm going to let the browser do what it's going to do, and I want it linear, right? The same way as before we can say if I want it, if we want it, ease in and out, etc., we still do that. And then the animation timeline, this is what tells it how to animate. I want to animate on scroll. And that's going to go ahead and tell it, instead of giving it a time, which usually like in animation, you'd give it 2 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever the case might be. Oftentimes are more in milliseconds, but there you go. This is going to tell it to scroll. Now notice here, I also have done the same thing on the background. So as it scrolls, the background color changes. This is the second animation. So you can have multiple animations, and it's all based on the scroll of that animation. So that is one way to do it. The other way is if you wanted to do something more parallax related. So in this case, as you scroll, I'm forcing the colors of these rectangles to stay put and to keep my gradient. So in this case, I've told it that the background, right, the background for my for each of my containers, each of these rectangle containers, it goes from pale goldenrod to pale turquoise. And then what I'm doing, and since here my timeline animation instead of scroll is view block. So I'm essentially telling it, I want you to stay put, and as it scrolls, you're going to increase through my animation. You're going to increase through my animation, right? So that's why even though I'm scrolling my squares, I'm maintaining that gradient of colors right there. Which is based on the background creates that illusion of a gradient. So that's kind of two ways we can use those scroll-based animations. Is one, if I go back, and is to basically change as you scroll. The other way is if we're doing like a view block situation, we can stay put and keep a certain layout as you scroll, which is would be an interesting way to do parallax, for example. The support on that is, well, dubious because Safari and Firefox are lagging behind. So that's one that you will need to try on either Chrome or Edge. So basically Chromium browsers is pretty much it. Although Opera has it as well for Opera users, which is really cool. The nice thing about scroll type animations is that oftentimes it's one of those that for a fallback, you just kill the animation, right? You can do an add supports on the specific animation. If it has it, you animate. If it doesn't, it doesn't. For the most part, a lot of times, we're not going to lose as much. It's not as cool, but at least it doesn't break your code. Scroll snap is another thing, although not quite as new as some of the other things we talked about in terms of scrolling. And what scroll snap, this one's hard to say, by the way. Try to say it 5 times fast and you'll see. Scroll snap allows us to basically take a piece of whatever view and force it to kind of, as its name implies, snap at a particular point in the view. Usually it's done at the top of the window, but it doesn't have to be. You can actually adjust that. I have an article and in a YouTube video if you ever want to check it out on how to do that if you have a sticky header where you're specifically trying to snap under the header, for example. So you can absolutely tell it where to snap, and you can do it vertically or horizontally. So the properties we're going to look at with scroll snap are the scroll snap type, which is going to be mandatory versus proximity. Mandatory means as you scroll, it's going to forcibly snap up to the next thing. So that's pretty cool for things where you're like trying to do view-based, layouts where you're basically snapping from view to view or maybe from picture to picture. Proximity is as you get close to where it would snap, it's going to go ahead and snap. Now, how close is browser specific? Good luck on that. The scroll snap padding is how much, that's when I was talking about whether you want to, to offset a little bit. So if, let's say if I do a scroll align start, this is this third property, which I want it to snap at the start of the container, right? Then the offset snap would say if I do a start and I say an offset of 10 pixels, then it's going to go down by 10 pixels. Or if I do negative 10 pixels, then it'd be up by 10 pixels, right? So you do have that snapping element in terms of where in terms of your container you want to snap, and then you can offset it by using the snap pattern. So here's an example of snapping. Basically what I have is I have a grid with a number of rows in my view height, and I'm going to go ahead and take my main container and force it to snap at the top. Now notice that the scroll snap type, I have two properties. I have Y and proximity. So if you can choose vertical, which is going to be Y, or horizontal, which is going to be X, and then, or you could do both, right? You can choose the top, and then I'm giving it a 10 pixel on the PX in order for it to go ahead and align different to snap 10 pixels below. That's why you see the band of gray here, because I'm snapping 10 pixels below. The support on scroll snap is pretty good. Even I know I said I was going to ignore IE, but even IE just started implementing it. It's obviously doesn't matter anymore, but so the support for scroll snap is definitely there. One thing to consider though when using scroll snap, especially with mandatory, is make sure that the user can read the entirety of the content on their screen, because if they cannot, they won't be able to, as they try to scroll, it's going to take them to the next thing. They're never going to be able to see anything that was not into view if the content that you're snapping between is bigger than the view. New units. This is where units, when you're trying to figure out your viewport size, comes into play. We have several new units that are really, really helpful. Small viewport height, small viewport width, large viewport height, large viewport width, and dynamic. So the thing to consider is when you have, and this is especially true on browsers, your screen size versus the size that is actually available to you depending on tools versus no tools will vary, right? And depending on the whether you're on iOS versus Android, the tooling is going to be a little bit different. So these properties allow us to go ahead and figure out what the actual view size is based on what's actually available, so that we're not overflowing over or under the tools that the device may be adding. So that's where my personal favorite is dynamic viewport, because it figures out what it needs to figure out on its own, which is awesome. Keep in mind though, it does not take in consideration the virtual keyboard. So let's say you have a form and you're basing things about your form on, let's say, dynamic view height or dynamic view width. When the keyboard pops up above all that, it will not resize the screen. So it does not take any consideration of that. It will, however, any tooling or whatever, or any toolbars that the actual OS is adding into play, that would change, because your actual height versus like your view height or your view width may be different than your actual available view height and view width based on those tools. So here's an example of using that. Here's a height of 100 dynamic view height. And I mean, it works the same way as doing a normal view height or view width. The cool thing about that on the support is quite good on it. But if you are worried about going ahead and it's, I mean, 91%, right? If you are worried about creating a fallback for that, all you have to do is the property before that, for example, say height of like 100 view width or 100% or whatever the case might be, because the next one, if the browser has it implemented and can do it, it'll go ahead and override. If the browser doesn't know what to do with it, it'll just take the previous value. So that's one of the ones that, even though the support is only at 90%, is really, really easy to start using today, simply because the fallback on it is one of the easier ones to go ahead and create a fallback for. So we covered a lot. We covered a huge amount, which are pseudo-classes is where has nth child contain queries, including size and style. Nesting, which is super cool. I'm really excited about that one. Typography, text wrap letter, initial letter. Transform properties, which are just, I mean, they work the same way they always have. It's just a syntactical difference that we can use. We don't have to. The old syntax is not going away. Scroll-driven animation, scroll snap, and dynamic viewport units. With that, there is the code samples. There were a number of examples. It is available on GitHub. My GitHub is GitHub handle is Martine-Dowden. I'll leave this up for a second if anybody wants to get that URL or QR code. It's on the repo name is CSS is awesome, just like the name of this presentation.
Thanks, Martine. I'll leave that up for a moment just so that people get that URL.
Yep. And the last one is, which is also, this presentation has a link to the repo and everything, is a link to my website, which is martine.dev, where you can find all of my things, publications, my latest book, Tiny CSS projects, and all that fun jazz. But there you go.
Awesome. God, there was so much stuff in that presentation. I didn't I will admit that I'm like, as I said in the beginning, I'm not really an expert at CSS. I know enough to kind of jump in when I need to, but not enough. Like I didn't even realize all these new things were there already, and some of them are super cool. Very some of them, like the nesting, I feel like we've gotten used to that in things like SAS and so on, but it's been forever. I mean, we've been doing that forever that way, and it's surprising to me that like it took that long to finally come around and just make it part of CSS.
I'm so excited about that because every time I have to write something in actual CSS, I'm like, I want to nest it, and then it's like errors blows up or doesn't actually do anything, and I'm like, oh, duh.
Yeah. I'm gonna put your stuff back on state. They want to go, if you don't mind going back. Somebody was asking for that GitHub URL again.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, let's go back and put that back up. Okay. I'm gonna try and type it in so people have it.
I can give you, yeah, I can give you the link here.
But yeah, paste it in the little private
Yeah.
chat if you can do that, and I will paste it
Yep.
into the chat. So we did have a couple of questions as well, folks. While we get this URL there for you, I will. You can go ahead and ask your questions on the chat, and I will ask them of Martine as time allows here. Okay, I got that. Let me paste that in.
And I just double checked it. It actually works. Well, I copied it because it wouldn't let me copy paste it from the presentation because I don't know why. And so I was like, I copied it. So I was like, I should check that because typos happen.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, I do that all the time. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead, since it's now in the chat, and I'll paste it here as well on YouTube. Since we've got like multi-streaming going on, it complicates all this stuff. Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna ask the question that came in from Martin. He asked, are there performance concerns to be aware of for any of these capabilities?
Probably. like the answer to that is pretty much always going to be yes. Animation specifically can get quite heavy. Transform historically has had some things. So, but I mean, it really depends. How much of it are you doing, and how much of it are you, and how big of an area you're doing, right? So because you're it's the same as always. It's how much of it and how big of an area and your reflow and right. So it really
Mm.
depends. It's the typical. I'm going to give the typical developer answer. It depends. um,
Yep.
but um, not that I not that there's nothing that is out of the ordinary that I am aware of, because a lot of these, if you think about it, are already expanding on a currently existing um on a currently existing thing, right? Like scroll animation or an expansion on animation. So any concern that you would have had in terms of your performance on animation stays true in scroll animation, for example.
Okay.
So all of the right, so a lot of these are building on previously existing things. So any concern that would have existed on their previous one still exists today on that one because it's building on that previous implementation.
Okay, that makes sense. So I think Tony was asking, and I'm gonna assume that it's kind of the same thing I was thinking, more along the lines of around adoption. Like, what level of adoption by the browsers do you think is necessary before you're like, okay, this is right? I mean, everything seemed to waver between about 60%, some of them much less, but like 60% to 90%. Like, where is it you start feeling like, okay, this is ready for me to use regularly?
It depends on the project. And it depends on my user base. So there is actually a plugin for can I use to be able to pipe can I use and analytics together, so that can I use can kind of tell you based on your user base if something is likely to what percentage of your user base is gonna if for which a particular property would be problematic for. So that's one way to kind of figure that out. But keep in mind that analytics can lie to you in that use case. Because I was on a project, for example, where they're like, oh well, we have no mobile users, we don't need to worry about mobile. Their site was completely unusable on mobile. I'm like, well, you don't have mobile users not because your users don't want to use mobile. You don't have mobile users because your site is unusable on mobile, right? So
Yeah.
be careful of that concept when you're using analytics to decide, yes, I can use this property, no, I can't, simply because of those kind of aspects. But it's a tolerance level you have to decide in terms of how many users are you willing to not have or not have a particular thing. The other piece is a lot depending on the property. You can do a fallback or you can do an at supports in order to go ahead and change the functionality until you have a higher adoption. So it
Mhm.
really depends on how it's really property specific, I think. Like scroll snap, for example, I'm like for most of my personal projects, I'm like, yeah, I'll put it. Well, it's supported pretty much across the board now. But let's say timeline animations, for example, if I want to do something really cool with like some parallax or whatever, like it's one of those things. It's like if you don't have it, it's not affecting the functionality. So I think it also kind of depends on, is this going to hinder the usage of the page? And then you just have a stylistic different and it's not as cool for X%, or is it going to completely, like if you use nesting and the person doesn't have nesting, that person's not going to have that CSS and it could potentially break their ability to use the page or make it really, really gnarly. So it really depends on the feature, it depends on the tolerance of your user base, and it depends on what the purpose of the site is, right? If the site is something critical to the functioning of something, then probably you want to stick to that 99. I don't think there's a single property that has 100%. Maybe there is on the really, really early, maybe background, for example, has 100%, but like you're going to want to keep to those really high percentages. If it's a whatever game that's really just an entertainment thing, then it's maybe not as important. It's up to you to determine how important it is to you, and depending on does it
Mm.
actually affect functionality or not, or kind of the
Right.
two big questions.
So Claudia asks, are there accessibility concerns related to any of these
Oh,
features?
absolutely, absolutely. Animations for sure. Animations. You definitely want to wrap these in a like any, especially if you're playing with parallax, especially if you're playing with movement. You're definitely want to wrap these in a prefers reduced motion query, because there is a query that you can put the same way as you use it. It's a media query. You can check out that. We'll go ahead and tell you if a user's settings is preferred to reduce motion on their actual device, and so that way you can dial down or completely remove animations based on whether they have that as set to preferred. So there's definitely some there. Anything that involves color, obviously, you have color contrast is definitely a thing. I'm trying to think of the other ones that would be big ones of everything we've covered. Those are the big two based on the set. Typography, changing that first letter to being a lot bigger decreases your legibility a little bit. So it's probably something I wouldn't recommend if you're dealing with a populace that, maybe like it's an app for first grade kids that are just learning how to read. Probably not a great idea for that populace. So that's very populace dependent. But so there's definitely, like, anytime you're mucking with typography anyway, you're going to have to consider the legibility of the text. But those are
Okay.
the big ones based on the set that I can think of. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we are just about at time here. So I know really appreciate you coming. I know you have a busy schedule, so I really appreciate this presentation. Obviously, there was a lot of questions from the audience. So and you definitely showed a lot of things. I didn't realize there was so many new things. Some of them I'm particularly excited about, like I know for my site, the one where you have the dangling word that I forget
Oh,
which
balance,
property that
text
was.
balance. Yeah.
Balance, yeah, that
Yeah.
happens all the time with titles, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just that would help so much.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you so much for this presentation. So to everybody who attended, I really appreciate whether you attend on YouTube, Crowdcast, or LinkedIn. I really appreciate you attending this presentation. Look for the meetups coming next month. I've already posted one of those. We'll have more coming soon, as well as all our live coding shows and interview shows and all that other stuff. So please check those out, and see you next time. Bye.